So I'm actually concerned about you all. I don't feel like you guys know enough about the Beaver Wars. The Beaver Wars that happened here in North America in the 1600s. Or the French and Indian Wars. We've had 4 total French and Indian Wars, spanning from 1688 to 1762. So for nearly 80 years, for 70 to 80 years, the French and Indian Wars, which preceded the American Revolution, but happened here on this continent, hasn't been discussed or talked about. The 1600s Beaver Wars, which is fighting for beavers, right, which is something that happens, that's very common today. But essentially the idea was the beaver fur trade, and, we still have problems with the beaver fur trade today. But that's that's human trafficking. Beaver Wars was actually about beavers, about the animals, the rodents that swim through the streams and build dams. Native Americans would kill them and sell them for guns and weapons and manufactured goods from the English, and so that was the trade, that was the economic relationship in North America. Iroquois were armed by their Dutch and English trading partners, the Algonquin, your Shawnee, and others, your Lenape, Shawnee, were backed by the French, who is their chief trading partner. So the Iroquois were armed by the Dutch and the English, the Dutch Republic, England. And the wars, the Beaver Wars, were brutal, considered one of the bloodiest series of conflicts in the history of North America, as the Iroquois destroyed several large tribal confederacies, including the Huron, the Neutral, Erie, Susquehannock, and the Shawnee, supposedly. So on the English and Dutch side, you had the Iroquois. On the French side, you had Huron, Erie. So the Huron, Erie, Neutral, Ottawa, Ojibwe, Mississaugas, Potawatomi, Algonquin, Shawnee, Winrow, Mohican, Innu, Abenaki, Miami, Illinois Confederation, and other nations allied with France. So this is why France was able to win all these native French and Indian wars. And that's the reason why the French won these French and Indian Wars, was because they were able to mobilize the Native Americans way better. And they did it a lot of times, especially in Esquipakithiki. Esquipakithiki is the last Shawnee town in Kentucky, and it's in Clark County today. So that's wonderful, right? George Rogers Clark, one of the worst Indian killers in the last Shawnee village permanent establishment, was in that we know about, was in Esquipakithiki. And so Esquipakithiki was the French had traded with the Native Americans, and since they were more on equal footing, they were being used, but it seems like the French respected their autonomy. So the Huron, that's why the Huron, the Erie, the Neutral, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, Mississaugas, Potawatomi, Algonquin, Shawnee, Winrow, Mohican, Innu, Abenaki, Miami, Illinois Confederation. So that's a confederation, so that's at least 16 tribes, but a confederation is more, so how many more, right? These all sided with France. England and the Dutch Republic had the Iroquois. The 5 nations of the Iroquois. And the Iroquois are pretty fascinating too. That's how we got the idea of the federal government. The Iroquois was 5 nations, the Onondaga and the Mohawks and the Seneca and I don't know, 2 other ones. And then there's the Tuscaroras. So they're the 6th nation that eventually get included into it. And the Tuscarora were the hemp peoples. They were known as the hemp people. Hemp, like marijuana hemp. And so that was the Tuscarora people. And Captain Pipe, who is the star of the Captain Pipe series, which is what this entire thing is about, was named after a tobacco pipe, which also could have been a marijuana pipe or a marijuana bowl. So Captain Pipe, and it's Captain, that's totally anglicized. His name was Conesh Quanohil. And so imperialist colonies in North America. So trying to paint up a picture here. We had all those 4 French and Indian wars before our story even really begins. So the imperialist colonies in North America, Native Americans have been here for at least 14,000 years. There's some evidence that sinkhole in Florida saying that they actually have been here for even longer than 14,000 years. And it wasn't over the land bridge in Siberia and Alaska, but they actually either came by boats or maybe they just been here the longest. But there have been several nations. The French was in the Mississippi Valley in Canada. So the French were in Mississippi Valley, and they were in Canada. The Dutch were here. The Scots-Irish were here colonizing Spanish Florida. De Soto was Spanish, Portuguese. You had Swedish, Finnish colonies. Of course, the English was the 13 original colonies. The French and the English, and they were the ones that was responsible for the French and Indian Wars. You have the Swedish, you have the Finnish, they're pretty much the same thing. English, 13 original colonies. Remember, there was New Sweden, New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, became New York in the New England area. So French, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Scots-Irish, English, Swedish. Those were all the imperialist countries who were trying to colonize North America. The ones in, at least present day, the United States. French and Indian Wars, while some of the conflicts involved Spanish and Dutch forces, all of them pitted the Kingdom of Great Britain, or England, didn't become Great Britain until Queen Anne, its colonies and Native Americans on one side, France's colonies and Native Americans on the other side. So it's England versus France. So because of a war in Europe, the colonies in North America were fighting too. And remember, there's 4 French and Indian Wars. I think the Intercolonial War actually might be the best name for these. King William's War would be your first colonial war, Intercolonial War, and that was 1688 to 1697. So for 9 years at the end of the 1600s, the 17th century. So 1688 to 1697. It's King William's War. Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about King William's here in a second. I'm going to list all these French and Indian Wars. The second French and Indian / Intercolonial War was Queen Anne's War, the second one. So that's 1702 to 1713. So the 1600s is largely characterized by the Beaver Wars, and then we get into the French and English conflicts, Intercolonial Wars. Okay, so Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. Then there's Father Rale's War. This is a French and Indian War, but it's not considered one of the main ones. That's 1722 to 1725. Then the third Intercolonial War, French and Indian War, was King George's War. This is King George II. Not the first, not the third, not the fourth, not the fifth, not the sixth or the seventh. In fact, King George VI, they made a movie about him with the King's speech. He got up and was nervously having to make a speech during Hitler's time, and actually in Britain's period, it's called the Georgian era. So there's King George 1, 2, 3, 4. Then it goes to, I think, King William, another King William. So King George's War lasts from 1744 to 1748 for 4 years. Queen Anne's War lasted for 11 years, and King William's War lasted for 9 years. Then you have another small French and Indian War that's not considered an intercolonial war. So Father Le Loutre's War lasted from 1749 to 1755. This is nestled in between King George's War, 1744 to 1748, and the fourth Intercolonial War, the French and Indian War, the one that that George Washington, not King, he's kind of a dictator. He kills all them deserters. He's a 7th generation plantation owner, so he's totally a fascist oppressor. But for some reason he's able to conjure up images of revolution. So King George's War 1744 to 1748, La Loutre's War 1749 to 1755, and then the fourth Intercolonial War, French and Indian War 1754 to 1763. So 1754 to 1763, it's 9 years. That's why they also call it the 7 Years' War. So the fourth Intercolonial War, sometimes called the 7 Years' War. King William's War, the first Intercolonial War, sometimes called the 9 Years' War. It was actually 9 years. King William's War actually lasted for 9 years. That's why it got the name the 9 Years' War. You have Father Le Loutre. So Father Le Loutre, he is kind of a badass. He's a Catholic priest. and he's a killer. He's a military commander. He has his own war. His war is 6 years, and that means it's 2 years longer than King George II's war in 1744 to 1748. I also, let's see, I noticed two things here. Why don't the French and English get along with each other? Like, what the fuck? Like, for 100 years they're just fighting their stupid shit in Europe, and it's spilling over here, and it's devastating to the French in the long run, because they get expelled from the North American continent. The years also blend in with Father Le Loutre's War, 1749 to 1755. So 1754 to 1763 is the traditional years given to the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War, the one with George Washington, began the Fourth Intercolonial War. The difference with this war, though, is that it started in North America first and then bled to Europe. So whereas the first three French and Indian Wars, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War, started in Europe, spilled over to North America. The Fourth Intercolonial French and Indian War started in America and bled over to Europe. It was that war started with a skirmish in the backwoods in, you know, the middle of fucking bumfucked Egypt. And so the tail wagged the dog, right? They started a war, and then 2 years later, 1756, is when it actually, they declared in Europe. But the years blend over, so it makes the years suspect. Le Loutre's War goes from 1749 to 1755. If 1754 is the beginning of the French and Indian War, that means there's still one war going on. Le Loutre's War is still going on. So I don't see how that's not part of the bigger picture. If these are both French and Indian wars, then it almost seems as if the French and Indian War should have lasted from 1749 to 1763. King William's War. This is the first of the 6 colonial wars. King William's War is the first French and Indian War. It is also known as the Second Indian War, the Father Bowden's War, Caston's War, or the First Intercolonial War in French. King William's War was the North American theater, the 9 Years' War, also known as the War of the Grand Alliance, or the War of the League of Augsburg. So this is a European conflict. They're fighting over Grand Alliances and Leagues of Augsburgs, and then that spills over to America. The namesake of King William's War comes from King William of England, of William and Mary. I think there's a William and Mary College. William and Mary of the Glorious Revolution. They called it the Glorious Revolution when they deposed of King James, of the King James Bible, the flaming homosexual monarch. But that's not the reason they got rid of him. It was his Catholicism. So William and Mary in the Glorious Revolution deposed of King James, who actually was Mary's father. So that's treacherous, right? And William and James were first cousins. So this is all an inter-family rivalry kind of fucking weird bullshit. And why I don't understand why we're declaring wars all the time. Just to be declaring wars just for the fuck of it. So William is also the same William who signed the English Bill of Rights, and he ended Catholic rule. He ended Catholic rule in England. King James II runs to King Louis the 14th, France. So William and Mary. Namely, William is the Dutch Prince of Orange. William of Orange, the Dutch Prince. So the Dutch Prince takes over England. So is it Dutch England now? And King William III and II, he's somehow the third and the second, his spouse and his first cousin, Queen Mary II. King William III and the second and Queen Mary II, who are first cousins, are married. They took over England, and King William started a war of the Leagues of Augsburg. He really hated the Augsburg, or he loved them, or something, I don't know. The French and Iroquois Confederacy in North America were allies. British and Wabanaki natives were allies. They fought in northwestern America near Maine, or northeast. New France and the Wabanaki Confederacy were able to thwart the New England expansion into Acadia, whose border New France defined as the Kennebec River in southern Maine according to the terms of the Treaty of Ryswick. The boundaries and outposts of New France, New England, and New York remained substantially unchanged. So sort of the status quo, antebellum, something. Okay, so French and Iroquois Confederacy were allies. I already mentioned all this. Point Royal. After New Englanders fought with their blood to take it over, it was given back to the French after the Treaty of Ryswick, September 20th, 1697, had ended the hostilities. So New England takes over Point Royal, and then the French take it back because in England, or in Ryswick, there's actually a big fucking monument wherever Ryswick is at in fucking Russia. Treaty of Ryswick ends the hostilities in Europe, so it's signed over Europe, and then Point Royal, even though New Englanders took it over, they have to give it back. The French colonies of Acadia and Canada, along with their native allies, notably the Abenaki, Pennacook, and the Huron, fought the northern English colonies and their native allies, notably the Iroquois, especially the Mohawk. In this theater, the French had been on the ascendant. All the English assaults on French possessions had been repulsed. Fort Penobscot on the border of Acadia had been destroyed. The frontiers of both New England and New York had been ravaged and forced back. The English outpost in Newfoundland had been destroyed and the island virtually conquered. In addition, throughout the war, England's claims to the Hudson Bay have been severely contested in a series of French expeditions culminating in Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville's capture of York Factory shortly before the signing of the treaty. In spite of this, the Treaty of Ryswick returned the territorial borders to where they had been before the war. So France did the same thing. Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville captured the York Factory. So they had to give up the York Factory, the French did, and the English had to give up their Point Royal. So in spite of this, the Treaty of Ryswick returned the territorial borders to where they had been before the war, status quo ante bellum. Status quo ante bellum, the way it was before the war. The Iroquois nation, deserted by their English allies, continued to make war on the French colonies until the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. Rightfully so, the Iroquois pissed off. It's like, we fucking allied with you all, now you guys are just going to stop fighting. King William's War in the Caribbean, the way it happened down there. Spain, the effects of it. Spain formally recognized French control of some Caribbean territory, such as the Tortuga Island and the western third of the adjacent island of Hispaniola, where the French colony of Saint Domingue had been established. King William's War. The second intercolonial French and Indian War is Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. Queen Anne, this is the same Anne of Annapolis, Maryland. Annapolis, Maryland, which is home of St. John's College, as well as the United States Naval Academy. Anne had 14 miscarriages. I don't know if she ever had a kid that lived. But Queen Anne of Annapolis, she has a war. I'm not for sure what is up with William and Mary. They're kissing cousins, these weird crooked-ass monarchs, William and Mary. This weird ancestral relationship where they're going to depose of Mary's father. So was the father against the cousins being married? And so eventually Anne becomes the Queen of England, and she isn't able to have any kids, probably because of all that ancestral blood is in her. She becomes the Queen of England. She has 14 miscarriages. Alright, so she became the Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland on March 9th, 1702. And then May 1st, 1707, under the Acts of Union, two of her realms, the kingdoms of England and Scotland, which is on the same island, united as a single sovereign state known as Great Britain. So Great Britain formed in 1707. She continued to reign as Queen of Great Britain and Ireland until her death. Queen Anne's War. Queen Anne's War lasted from 1702 to 1713 as the North American theater of the War of the Spanish Succession, as was known in the British colonies, was the second in a series of French and Indian wars fought between France and England, later Great Britain, in North America for control of the continent, the War of the Spanish Succession. So there's a war over the Spanish Succession, which is just, they don't have a person who's going to take over the kingdom. They weren't able to have a baby. And so there's a balance of power disturbance. There's been a great disturbance in the force when the monarch, king or queen, can't pass the crown on to one of their own in their own bloodlines. Some shit's about to go down when that happens, and that's the War of Spanish Succession. And that's the reason why we had Queen Anne's War, was this War of Spanish Succession. So Spain actually allied with France. So in addition to England, or the Great Britain and France, the war also involved numerous Native American tribes allied with each nation. And Spain, who allied with France, it was also known as the Third Indian War, or in French as the Second Intercolonial War. The war was fought on three fronts. Three fronts that Queen Anne's War was being fought on was the Spanish Florida front and English province of Carolina. So Florida and Carolina, but Spanish Florida and English Carolina were subjected to attacks from the other. The English engaged the French based at Mobile, in what was essentially a proxy war involving primarily allied Native Americans on both sides. The Southern War, although it did not result in significant territorial changes, had the effect of nearly wiping out the native population of Spanish Florida, including parts of present-day southern Georgia, and destroying Spain's network of missions in the area. Queen Anne's War, 1702-1713. Queen of the 14 miscarriages. Queen Anne of Annapolis, Maryland, where the United States Naval Academy, and St. John's College, and probably a McDonald's and some other shit. The English colonies of New England fought with French and Native American forces based in Acadia in Canada. Quebec City was repeatedly targeted but never successfully reached by British expeditions, and the Acadian capital Port Royal was taken again in 1710. The French and Wabanaki Confederacy sought to thwart New England expansion into Acadia, whose border New France defined as the Kennebec River in southern Maine. Toward this end, they executed raids against targets in Massachusetts, including present-day Maine, most famously raiding Deerfield in 1704. On Newfoundland, following the preliminary peace in 1712, the Treaty of Utrecht ended the war in 1713. The result in the French cession of claims to the territories of Hudson Bay, Acadia, and Newfoundland to Britain, while retaining Cape Breton and other islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Some of its terms were ambiguous, and concerns of various Native American tribes were not included in the treaty, setting the stage for future conflicts. That's 1702 to 1713. So just after Queen Anne's War, either 1720, 1724, 1725, Cayasuda was born, and Cayasuda was later the principal chief of the Seneca Iroquois, the Ohio Mingo Seneca. So out of the 5 nations or 6 nations of the Iroquois, Seneca was one of those nations, and Cayasuda was the chief of one of those nations. By all accounts, Cayasuda was born circa 720 in western New York as a youth. However, he migrated southward with his family down the Allegheny River to western Pennsylvania. Being a descendant of renowned Seneca warriors, in adulthood he was described as a tribal chief by various European sojourners. Seneca Mingo tribe, one of the 6 that made up the Iroquois nation. Okay, so Cayasuda is born before Father Rale's War, but after Queen Anne's War. Father Rale's War, 1722 to 1725, aka Dummer's War, aka Lovewell's War, aka Greylock's War. The 3 Years' War, it was 1722 to 25. The 4th Anglo-Abenaki War, or the Wabanaki New England War of 1722 to 1725. It's a regional conflict, a series of battle between New England and the Wabanaki Confederacy, specifically the Micmac, the Maliseet, and Abenaki. The Eastern Theater of the Wars fought primarily along the border between New England and Acadia in present-day Maine, as well as in Nova Scotia. The Eastern Theater was fought in northern Massachusetts and Vermont at the border between Canada, New France, and New England. During this time, Massachusetts included present-day Maine and Vermont. Sebastian Rackel, anglicized as Sebastian Rale, Raleigh, Rosles, January 20th, 1657, he was born. He dies August 23rd, 1724, and his death is propaganda This is a picture of Father Rale's war. Is Father Rale getting killed in front of everybody, cold-bloodedly, but that's not exactly how it happened. So Father Rale was a Jesuit missionary, lexicographer, who worked among the eastern Wabanaki people. He was stationed on the border of Acadia in New England and helped protect the border of Acadia by encouraging raids upon the British settlements in present-day Maine. He fought throughout King William's War and Queen Anne's War, eventually being killed by the British during Father Rale's War. The root cause of the conflict on the Maine frontier was over the border between Acadia and New England, which New France defined as the Kennebec River in southern Maine. After the British siege of Port Royal in 1710 and the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, mainland Nova Scotia, not including Cape Breton, came under British control, but both present-day New Brunswick and virtually all of present-day Maine remained contested territory between New England and New France. New France, to secure its claim to the region, established Catholic missions, churches among the 4 largest native villages in the region, one on the Kennebec River, Norridge Walk, one further north on the Penobscot River, one on the St. John River, Medoc, and one at Shubenacadie, St. Anne's Mission. Similarly, during Father Loutre's War, New France established 3 forts along the border of present-day New Brunswick to protect it from a British attack from Nova Scotia. Complicating matters further on the Nova Scotia frontier, the Treaty of Utrecht that ended Queen Anne's War had been signed in Europe and not involved any member of the Wabanaki Confederacy. While the Abenaki signed the Treaty of Portsmouth 1713, none had been consulted about British ownership of Nova Scotia, and the Micmac protested through raids on New England fishermen and settlements. The war began on 2 fronts as a result of the expansion. Micmac protested through raids on New England fishermen and settlements. So the Abenaki signed the Treaty of Portsmouth, but none had been consulted about British ownership of Nova Scotia. The war began on 2 fronts as a result of the expansion of New England settlements along the coast of Maine and at Canso, Nova Scotia. The New Englanders were led primarily by Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts William Dummer, Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia John Doucette, and Captain John Lovewell. The Wabanaki Confederacy and other native tribes were led primarily by Father Sebastian Rale, Chief Greylock, and Chief Paugus, P-A-U-G-U-S. Chief Greylock and Chief Paugus were fighting with the Wabanaki Confederacy of Sebastian Rale. During the war, Father Rale was defeated and executed by the British at Norridge Walk. The native population retreated from the Kennebec and Penobscot rivers to St. Francis and Bécancour, Quebec, and New England took over much of the Maine territory. In present-day New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, the treaty that ended Father Rale's war marked a significant shift in European relations with the Micmac and Malecite. For the first time, a European power, in this case Britain, formally acknowledged that its dominion over Nova Scotia would have to be negotiated with the region's indigenous inhabitants.